This is one of those moments in life where everything you thought was solid crumbles in an instant. I'm Marcus, is 45. My wife, Samantha, is 44, and we've been married for 22 years. We met in medical school, fell in love over late-night anatomy study sessions, and built a life together as doctors. We have a son, Max, who's 21 and finishing his undergraduate degree in biochemistry, aiming to follow in our footsteps. On paper, we were the perfect family, successful careers, a bright future for our son, and a shared history that spanned decades. But life doesn't care about the stories we tell ourselves. It doesn't care about shared memories or years of commitment. Sometimes it just takes one moment, one truth, to shatter everything. I'll start at the beginning. It was an ordinary Thursday. Samantha and I worked at the same hospital, though in different departments. I'm a trauma surgeon, and she's a cardiologist. Our schedules rarely synced up perfectly, but we'd find moments to steal coffee breaks together or exchange quick smiles in the hallways. We both loved the chaos of the job. It was how we connected in the first place. We thrived on the adrenaline, the challenges, and the sense of purpose. That day, I was covering a particularly grueling shift. A car accident had sent 3 patients into the ER, and I was up to my elbows, literally in life-or-death decisions. By the time I got out of the ER, it was past midnight, and I was exhausted. Samantha's shift had ended hours earlier, so I assumed she'd gone home. I grabbed my things, drove home, and fell into bed without much thought. The first sign something was off came the next morning. I woke up to find Samantha already gone. Normally, we'd have breakfast together if our schedules allowed, but she'd left without a word. I brushed it off. It wasn't unusual for her to head in early for rounds or an unexpected consult. But as the day went on, little things started piling up. She didn't answer my texts, not even a quick acknowledgement, which was unlike her. And when I passed by her office later that afternoon, it was empty. That evening, we finally crossed paths at home. Samantha was distant, her usual warmth replaced by a vague distractedness. She said she was tired and had a lot on her plate, which seemed plausible. After all, we were doctors. Stress was part of the job. But something about her demeanor felt off. She avoided eye contact. Her responses were curt, and she retreated to the study earlier than usual. I chalked it up to work stress, but that nagging feeling in the back of my mind refused to let go. Over the next few weeks, that distance between us grew. Samantha's work hours became longer, her mood more unpredictable. She started coming home later, often claiming last-minute emergencies or patient crises. At first, I didn't question it. I knew the demands of her job better than anyone. But then there were moments that didn't add up. Missed dinners, unexplained absences, and a general sense that she was slipping away from me. The breaking point came on a quiet Sunday morning. Max was home for the weekend, and we were all supposed to have breakfast together. Samantha said she had to run into the hospital for a consult and promised to be back by noon. But noon came and went. Then 2, 3, and finally she returned around 6 in the evening. She barely acknowledged us, heading straight for the shower and then to bed, leaving Max and me exchanging concerned glances. That night, I couldn't sleep. The weight of my suspicions pressed down on me, suffocating. I'd spent over 2 decades with this woman. I thought I knew her better than anyone. But now, I was starting to realize how much I didn't know. The next day, I decided to dig deeper. I started paying closer attention to her schedule, her behavior, the little details I'd once taken for granted. It didn't take long for patterns to emerge, patterns that pointed to one specific patient in her care. His name was Anthony, a 37-year-old recovering from a heart condition. He'd been under Samantha's care for months, and by all accounts, his prognosis was good. But the more I looked, the more I noticed how often his name came up. Samantha mentioned him frequently in passing, almost too casually, and she seemed unusually invested in his case. At first, I dismissed it as professional dedication. But when I saw his name on her calendar for what felt like the 10th time in a week, I couldn't ignore it any longer. I checked the hospital records, something I felt sick about doing but couldn't stop myself from pursuing. The pattern was clear. Samantha had spent an unusual amount of time with Anthony, far beyond what was necessary for her role. Consults, follow-ups, even after-hours visits that weren't logged in the system. It wasn't definitive proof, but it was enough to make my stomach churn. I started connecting the dots, replaying moments in my mind. The late nights, the unexplained absences, the distance between us. And suddenly it all clicked. This wasn't just a professional relationship. It was something more, something that crossed every boundary we'd built our marriage on. I didn't confront her right away. I couldn't. Not without knowing for sure. Not without proof. Instead, I waited, watched, and tried to keep my emotions in check. But inside, I felt like I was unraveling, one thread at a time. I couldn't shake the feeling that my entire world was built on quicksand. Everything Samantha and I had built together, our family, our careers, our marriage, suddenly felt fragile, as if one wrong step could send it all crumbling. The suspicion was eating away at me, but I knew I had to stay calm, rational, and deliberate. If I was going to face Samantha about this, I needed to be sure. The following week, I paid even closer attention to Samantha's patterns. She didn't know I'd already pieced together enough to suspect Anthony, and I played the role of the oblivious husband well. But behind the facade, I was tracking her every move. I checked her schedule whenever I could, noting her frequent consults with Anthony. I started asking myself questions I never thought I'd have to consider. Was she meeting him outside the hospital? Were they spending time together beyond the professional scope? And, most painfully, how long had this been going on? One night, I stayed late at the hospital, pretending to be tied up with paperwork. Samantha was supposed to be home by then, but as I walked through the halls, I spotted her car still in the parking lot. My pulse quickened. I told myself she could have had a legitimate reason to stay, but something inside me knew better. I decided to see for myself. The cardiology department was quiet, with most of the staff already gone for the night. I walked through the dimly lit corridors, my footsteps echoing against the sterile tiles. As I approached the wing where Anthony was staying, I slowed down, my chest tightening. I could hear faint voices coming from one of the rooms. Peeking around the corner, I saw Samantha through the window of Anthony's room. She was sitting on the edge of his bed, laughing at something he'd said. Her hand rested lightly on his arm, a gesture so intimate it made my stomach churn. She wasn't behaving like a doctor tending to a patient. She was behaving like someone who'd crossed a line. I turned and walked away before they could notice me. My hands were shaking as I made my way back to the parking lot. The image of Samantha in that room, so comfortable, so at ease with him, replayed in my mind like a cruel loop. That night, I barely slept. I kept telling myself I could be wrong, that there might still be an innocent explanation. But the more I thought about it, the more everything clicked into place. The late nights, the distance, the unexplainable absences. It was too much to ignore. The next day, I decided to dig deeper. I accessed her phone while she was in the shower, a violation of trust that felt necessary given the circumstances. What I found confirmed my worst fears. There were messages between Samantha and Anthony, buried deep in her chat history. They were careful, not outright incriminating, but the tone was unmistakable. They talked about how much they enjoyed their talks, about how he brightened her day, and how she couldn't wait to see him again. There was nothing professional about their relationship. I felt sick. For over 2 decades, Samantha and I had built a life together, and now I was staring at the evidence of her betrayal. My mind raced with questions. How long had this been going on? Had it started as an emotional affair, or had it crossed into something physical? And most importantly, how was I going to protect Max from this fallout? Max was home that weekend, and as much as I wanted to keep my suspicions from him, he started to notice the tension. Samantha was more distracted than ever, retreating into her phone whenever she thought no one was watching. I could see Max observing her, his brows furrowed in concern. He didn't say anything, but I knew he sensed something was wrong. By Sunday night, I couldn't hold it in any longer. I sat alone in my office, staring at the chat logs on my laptop, trying to decide what to do next. Confronting Samantha felt inevitable, but I also knew it would be messy. She'd deny it, twist it, turn it around on me. And even if she didn't, what would that solve? The damage was already done. Instead, I started preparing. If this was going to end in divorce, I needed to protect myself and Max. I began documenting everything, The messages, the hospital records, the unusual schedule changes. I made copies of our financial documents, ensuring I understood where we stood. I didn't know how far this would go, but I wasn't going to be caught off guard. The hardest part was knowing how to handle Max. He deserved to know the truth, but I couldn't bring myself to tell him yet. Not until I had a clear plan. For now, I focused on being there for him, keeping things as normal as possible while everything inside me felt like it was falling apart. As I write this, I'm still piecing together what comes next. The trust one had in Samantha is gone, and there's no coming back from that. But I have to stay strong. For Max, for myself, and for the life we deserve to rebuild. The strain of Samantha's behavior was no longer confined to the private cracks in our marriage. It was spilling out into the open, noticed by people who had no reason to be suspicious, but couldn't ignore what was right in front of them. The tipping point came during a family barbecue, an event that was supposed to bring everyone together, but only served to highlight how far Samantha had drifted. It had been Samantha's idea to host. She'd always loved entertaining, and the barbecue was no exception. The patio was set up perfectly, the grill was prepped, and the fridge was stocked with drinks. From the outside, everything looked picture-perfect. Samantha laughed easily with the guests, her energy seemingly boundless as she floated from one conversation to another. But for me, it was impossible to ignore the undercurrent of tension that had been building for weeks. As the afternoon unfolded, Samantha's behavior followed a now familiar pattern. She made casual references to Anthony, weaving him into conversations in a way that felt almost deliberate. It wasn't just the fact that she mentioned him. It was the tone, the subtle warmth in her voice that made my stomach tighten. To anyone else, it might have sounded like professional pride, but I knew better. The moment I realized how obvious her actions had become came when one of her cousins approached me. Samantha had mentioned Anthony again, this time describing him with a level of detail that felt more intimate than appropriate. The cousin, always one to observe and comment without hesitation, expressed concern about how much time Samantha seemed to be dedicating to this patient. The remark wasn't accusatory, but it hit like a gut punch. It wasn't just me noticing anymore. Other people were starting to piece together what Samantha's behavior meant. The rest of the barbecue felt surreal. I went through the motions of hosting, grilling burgers, refilling drinks, and laughing at jokes I didn't hear. But inside, I was unraveling. The image of Samantha casually talking about Anthony, weaving him into the narrative of our family event, stuck in my mind like a splinter. It wasn't just the betrayal that hurt. It was the sheer audacity of it. As the sun set and the guests began to leave, I watched Samantha from across the yard. She was smiling, her laugh effortless, as if she hadn't spent the last several months slowly dismantling everything we'd built. To everyone else, she looked like the perfect hostess, but to me, she was a stranger. The woman I'd met in medical school, the woman I'd built a life with, felt impossibly far away. That evening, after the guests had gone and the house was quiet, I sat alone in the living room. The weight of the day pressed down on me, suffocating. Samantha's actions weren't just careless. They were deliberate, and now even our family could see it. I stared at the framed photos on the mantel, images of a life that felt like someone else's. There was one of Samantha and me on a beach, our arms around each other, beaming at the camera. Another showed Max as a toddler, grinning as he played in the sand. Those moments felt distant, almost unreal. The fact that Samantha's obsession with Anthony had become noticeable to others was a breaking point. It wasn't just my suspicion anymore. It was something undeniable, something that couldn't be explained away or ignored. I knew I couldn't let this continue. It wasn't just about me or even Samantha anymore. Max was home for the weekend, and the tension in the air was palpable. He might not have said anything, but I could see the concern in his eyes. The time for waiting and hoping things would fix themselves was over. Samantha's behavior wasn't just a betrayal. It was a slow unraveling of everything we'd built. I couldn't let her take our family down with her. It was time to act, to protect Max and myself from the fallout of the life Samantha was tearing apart. It was one of those moments you can't unsee, the kind that burns itself into your memory so vividly that you know it'll haunt you forever. I'd been suspicious of Samantha's behavior for weeks, collecting pieces of evidence that hinted at something I didn't want to believe. But this moment, the one where I saw her with Anthony, solidified everything. There was no room for doubt anymore. The hospital had always been a place of purpose for me. It's where I met Samantha, where we built the foundation of our lives, and where I poured my energy into saving others. But that day, it became the backdrop for my worst nightmare. I'd finished my rounds early and decided to swing by Samantha's department. It wasn't unusual for us to check in on each other during breaks, a habit we'd started back in residency and carried into our careers. I thought maybe seeing her at work might help ease the growing tension between us. Maybe it would remind me of the person I'd fallen in love with all those years ago. But as I approached her wing, something stopped me. The hallway was quiet, almost eerily so, and Samantha's office door was ajar. I heard voices, hers clear and familiar, and a man's, softer but unmistakable. My heart began to pound. I told myself it could be a routine consult, a casual conversation. But the way they spoke, the laughter, the low, intimate tones, it didn't feel professional. I moved closer, staying out of sight, but with a clear view through the gap in the door. Samantha was standing near her desk, her body angled toward Anthony. He was seated on the edge of the desk, leaning in slightly. She was smiling in a way I hadn't seen in months. Open, warm, and completely unguarded. It was the kind of smile she used to reserve for me. And then it happened. She reached out, placing her hand on his arm, and leaned in. Their faces were inches apart. I wanted to look away, to leave before I saw what I already knew was coming. But I couldn't move. My feet were rooted to the spot, my chest tightening with every passing second. When their lips met, it was like the world around me disappeared. There was no sound, no movement, just the sharp, visceral pain of betrayal. It wasn't just a kiss. It was confirmation of everything I'd been trying to deny. They lingered for a moment, completely unaware of the man standing just feet away, watching his life fall apart. I backed away slowly, careful not to make a sound. My hands were trembling, my breath coming in short, shallow bursts. I turned and walked down the hall, each step feeling heavier than the last. By the time I reached the stairwell, I felt like I was suffocating. The walls seemed to close in around me, and the only thought running through my mind was that I needed to get out. I drove aimlessly for hours, replaying the scene over and over in my head. Samantha's smile, the way she touched him, the kiss, it all felt surreal, like a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. I tried to rationalize it, to tell myself there had to be some explanation. But there wasn't. The truth was staring me in the face, and no amount of denial could change it. That night, I didn't go home. I couldn't. The thought of seeing Samantha, of pretending everything was normal, was unbearable. Instead, I checked into a hotel and sat in the silence of the room, trying to make sense of what had just happened. The evidence I gathered, the growing distance between us, the late nights, it had all been leading to this moment. I knew I couldn't ignore it anymore. The marriage I thought I had was over, and there was no salvaging it. Samantha had made her choice, and now it was time for me to make mine. I wasn't just fighting for myself. I was fighting for Max, for the stability and integrity he deserved. The next steps were clear. I would confront Samantha, not to save our marriage, but to reclaim my life. I would file for divorce, protect Max, and ensure that Samantha's actions didn't destroy everything we'd built. After seeing Samantha kiss Anthony, the numbness I felt quickly gave way to something sharper, darker. I wasn't just heartbroken anymore. I was angry. Betrayal has a way of twisting the knife, and the longer I sat with it, the clearer my path became. Samantha had destroyed the trust in our marriage, and now she had to face the consequences. I started planning a divorce, methodically and carefully, the way I might approach a difficult case at the hospital. This wasn't just about splitting assets or walking away. It was about ensuring that Samantha's choices didn't leave me or Max in shambles. And, I'll admit, there was a part of me that wanted her to feel the sting of her own actions. The first step was meeting with a lawyer. I didn't tell Samantha, of course. She still thought I was in the dark, but I'd already begun documenting everything. The messages I'd seen on her phone, her erratic schedule, her growing attachment to Anthony, and now, the kiss. My lawyer assured me that while infidelity doesn't always guarantee a favorable outcome in divorce proceedings, the evidence could help protect my interests, especially when it came to custody of Max. But the divorce wasn't enough. It felt too clean, too easy for Samantha. She needed to face the reality of her actions, to feel the weight of her betrayal in the same way I had. That's when the idea came to me: anonymous emails. It was petty, sure, but the thought of Samantha living in fear, wondering when the truth would come out, gave me a sense of control I desperately needed. I created a new email account, completely untraceable, and started drafting messages. The first one was simple: "He knows." I sent it to her hospital email late at night, knowing she'd see it first thing in the morning. I imagined her reaction: the panic, the paranoia, the questions racing through her mind. The thought brought a grim satisfaction. The next message came a few days later. "Your husband will find out everything soon. Are you ready for that?" This time, I sent it while I knew she was at work, ensuring she'd see it during her rounds. I could picture her checking her phone, her breath catching as she read the words. I wanted her to feel the walls closing in, to know that her carefully crafted facade was crumbling. Over the following week, I sent more messages, each one carefully timed and worded to maximize her unease. "Does he know about Anthony yet? You've been so careless. It's only a matter of time." I didn't need to be explicit. Samantha's own guilt would do the work for me. At home, I kept my demeanor neutral, playing the role of the oblivious husband. But I could see the cracks forming. Samantha was jumpy, her phone practically glued to her hand. She avoided eye contact more than ever, and her usual composure seemed to be slipping. She even started coming home earlier, as if trying to re-establish some sense of normalcy. It was almost laughable. Max, bless him, was oblivious to the storm brewing beneath the surface. He was focused on school, spending his weekends studying or catching up with friends. I didn't want to drag him into the mess yet, not until I had a concrete plan. For now, I kept my focus on ensuring that when the divorce papers were served, I'd be in the strongest position possible. Behind the scenes, I continued building my case. I tracked Samantha's spending habits, noting the suspicious charges at restaurants and the unexplained withdrawals. I compiled a timeline of her absences, cross-referencing them with Anthony's hospital stays and follow-up appointments. Every detail mattered, and I wasn't about to let anything slip through the cracks. The letters, though, were my outlet. They allowed me to channel my anger into something tangible, something that kept Samantha on edge while I prepared for the inevitable confrontation. I imagined her lying awake at night, staring at the ceiling, wondering who knew her secret and how long she had before it all came crashing down. It wasn't just about revenge, it was about taking back control. Samantha had made me feel powerless, but now I was the one pulling the strings. She thought she could have her affair and keep her life intact, but she was wrong. I was going to make sure of that. Samantha thought she could have it all: a husband, a family, and an affair hidden behind the guise of her profession. But she underestimated me. After weeks of planning, documenting, and carefully executing my steps, the time had come to dismantle the life she had taken for granted. This wasn't just about the divorce anymore. It was about ensuring she faced the full consequences of her actions, both personally and professionally. By the time I filed for divorce, I had everything I needed. My lawyer presented a comprehensive case: evidence of her infidelity, her inappropriate relationship with Anthony, and how it compromised not only our marriage but also her position as a doctor. While infidelity itself wouldn't impact the division of assets, her unprofessional conduct as a cardiologist was a different matter. Her relationship with Anthony, a patient under her care, was a blatant violation of hospital policy and medical ethics. The first blow landed when I submitted an anonymous report to the hospital's board of directors. Using the evidence I had gathered, I detailed her inappropriate relationship with Anthony, including the excessive time she spent with him outside of necessary medical interactions. I included dates, documentation of her schedule, and even portions of the messages I'd found. I left nothing to chance. The hospital launched an internal investigation immediately. Samantha was blindsided. Her colleagues began to distance themselves, whispers spreading through the halls faster than she could contain them. The proud, respected cardiologist who once commanded admiration, now walked with her head down, her reputation hanging by a thread. The final blow came when the hospital made their decision. Samantha was placed on administrative leave pending further disciplinary action, effectively ending her career in that institution. Her name was removed from the leadership roles she'd worked so hard to achieve, and the respect she once commanded was replaced by quiet disdain. The medical community is small, and news of her misconduct spread quickly. Doors that were once open to her slammed shut. As for the divorce, it proceeded exactly as I'd planned. Samantha tried to negotiate for more time with Max, but the court sided with me. The evidence of her negligence and misplaced priorities, coupled with her professional downfall, left no question about who the more stable parent was. I was granted full custody, and Samantha's visitation rights were limited. She fought hard, but in the end, her choices left her with no leg to stand on. After the dust settled, I took time to reflect on everything I'd been through. 22 years of marriage, shattered by one person's selfishness. It's easy to let anger and bitterness consume you in a situation like this. But I've learned that moving forward is the greatest form of strength. Now it's just Max and me. The house is quieter, emptier, but also more peaceful. Samantha's absence no longer feels like a loss. It feels like the weight of her lies has finally been lifted. I've started focusing on myself again, reconnecting with friends, and rediscovering what it means to live on my own terms. To anyone out there reading this, who might be facing their own betrayal, you're stronger than you think. The road ahead will be painful, but it's also full of possibility. You don't have to let someone else's mistakes define you. You have the power to rebuild, to reclaim your life, and to find peace. And trust me, you will.